Heard around the world by everybody and their mama. The Jesse Lee Peterson Radio Show.
I have to tell you, as you know, if we don't rebuild men and families, goodbye, America. It is over. You can hang it up. Goodbye. I have with me someone who has focused in on this issue, Paul Raeburn. He's the author of Do Fathers Matter? What Science is Telling Us About the Parent We Have Overlooked. Paul Raeburn is here, and he will be taking your call. Paul, good morning, sir, and welcome to the show.
Good morning. Glad to be here. Thank you.
I totally appreciate you being here. A little bit about your background. In reading your book, I read that you're married. You have 5 children. This is your second marriage. With your first marriage, you had 2 boys and a girl. Your new wife, or second wife, you have 2 boys. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I'm a longtime science writer for the Associated Press and for Business Week, and I've been writing books for the last 10 years or so. I grew up in Michigan and spent a lot of time on the East Coast. I've been in New York City a long time now. And I write about a lot about families, genetics, biology, psychiatry, psychology-related things. And I had come upon the idea for this book following my last book, which was called Acquainted with the Night. And that was about raising children with depression and bipolar disorder. 2 of my older kids had some issues during adolescence. And so we worked through those things. They're doing great now. But we had some rough years there for a while. And when I finished that book and finished that period of my life, I was interested in, how much fathers can help in those situations. And I began to wonder, we all have lots of ideas about what fathers do and what our fathers meant to us. And, but some of those things are folklore and all kinds of opinions and not very authoritative. So I thought, what if we looked at the science and find out what we really know about what fathers do and what they contribute to their kids? What would we learn? So I think in Do Fathers Matter, what I've tried to do is collect what turns out to be an enormous body of research that most people haven't heard about how important fathers can be to their children. There's really a wealth of material here, and the book is full of good ideas about what we do and why we might be worth keeping around.
During the good old days when boys were boys and men were men, society understood the important role of a father and the impact that they had on family, on their children. Why did we lose that understanding of fatherhood?
Well, I think if I may, I'll take you back quite a while. I don't know, and there isn't really research on that particular question, but I have a suspicion. I think what happened makes sense. If we look back beyond the 20th century, back to the 19th century, most families either lived on farms or they were shopkeepers in the city, but families lived together.
Yes.
And in those days, kids, as soon as kids were old enough to help out on the farm or in the barn or in the shop, they helped out, and they spent a lot of time with their fathers, who were often running those enterprises, and their mothers too, of course. And the family was pretty unified. Both parents spent a lot of time with kids, made a lot of contributions. With the industrial era in the late 19th century and into the 20th century, that's when fathers started leaving the home and going off to work in the factory or in the city all day and coming back at night, sometimes too late to see their kids who would already be in bed. And that persisted for most of the 20th century. And so we got used to that. And, it just seemed like if mothers were spending more time with the kids, they must be more important for the kids. Fathers aren't around that much. That's what we thought. And that's the kind of myth that I wanted to try to, demolish with this book, because while that seemed reasonable, I don't think it was reasonable.
No.
And then I think what happened, what shocked us into the reality was over the last couple of decades when the economy ambushed us, and a lot of families, both parents had to go and work for wages outside the home. Sometimes mothers became the principal breadwinners. Fathers fathers stayed home with the kids, and that's all still shifting now. And now we can see, as we have more complicated arrangements, and some fathers do spend more time with their kids, that both parents are important. The fathers contribute a lot, and it shouldn't all fall to mothers the way we lulled ourselves into thinking for so long.
That's a very good point. I grew up on a plantation down in Alabama. My grandfather and my grandmother raised me, and you're right. I spent a lot of time working with my grandfather and being with him and around him. And then I had time with my grandmother, so I had both parents in my life, and it definitely made a difference. And I hadn't thought of it that way, in that I was around him a lot, whereas things have changed where kids are not around their fathers a lot for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think that was a fortunate experience you had. I don't know, maybe they worked you hard, so maybe you don't think it was so fortunate. But,
not while I was doing the work, that's for sure.
Yeah. So that's a kind of an old-fashioned way to grow up, and that had some distinct advantages. There's no question.
What were you were raised by father and mother?
Yes.
And were you close to both?
I was close to both. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, my father was worked 2 jobs to keep us going. So he was away a lot, and when he was home, he'd often fall asleep, after dinner and so forth. But we had an unusual situation in our family in the long before a lot of mothers started going back to work. My mother, started working nights in an office doing sort of cleanup work that hadn't been done during the day. Not literally cleanup, but doing office work and typing and such that hadn't been done during the day. And so my father was home, even though he worked 2 jobs. He was home at dinner every night, and we had dinner with my father while my mother was working. So we were fortunate in that respect that we had, a lot of time to spend with my mother after school, and then time to spend with my father at dinner and until we went to bed. So it was, my parents were sort of revolutionaries there, although that was not the intent. The intent was to make the mortgage and keep us fed and, have shoes for the winter.
That's great. So what type of person did you become as a result of having this time with your father?
Well, I think, in many ways I've imitated him, not consciously, but I discover, even now, I still discover things I'm doing that are very like what my father would do. When I help my kids with their projects or building Legos things, and my father was always very precise and very careful with those kinds of things. So I find myself doing that with the kids and trying to encourage them to be, to be careful with don't lose the small parts, and let's follow the directions closely and see what's going on here. I also find that I can be a little bit too much that way sometimes. So one of the things I learned from doing the research for Do Fathers Matter was, there are all these things about what fathers contribute, what they can do well and what they sometimes don't do so well. And I think people who read the book will be able to look at that and say, well, here's, everybody who reads it will find different things that they think are useful to them. What I found is that, having a warm relationship with kids is far more important than, say, being a disciplinarian or being strict with them and so forth. If you have a warm relationship
hold that thought, Paul. I'm sorry. Let me take this break, and when I come back, I'll let you finish that statement. 888-77-JESSE. Back in a moment.
Love and happiness. But wait a minute, something going wrong. Someone's on the phone, 3 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. Talking.
It's Manhood, our very, very important book. Do Fathers Matter? What Science is Telling Us About the Parent We Have Overlooked, by Paul Raeburn. And Paul is here. He is taking your phone calls at 888-77-53773. We will get to them, folks. Paul, you were mentioning that, talking about fathers should have a warm relationship with their children.
Yes, there was an interesting story that explains why this is important. We go back a ways here, but I think it's interesting to have a bit of historical perspective. During the Second World War, a lot of young men were failing their physicals. And so the question is, why? What's happening? What's wrong with our young men? And all the experts, all the people who were supposed to be the smart people said, well, we know what's wrong. These too many fathers have coddled their children and been too easy with them. They have to be strict and teach them to be tough and teach them to be men. And that seemed to make sense to everybody. When scientists looked at that a little more carefully, it turned out this was one of the many myths about fatherhood that turned out to be wrong. It's true that some very masculine, tough fathers were raising kids who were not passing their physicals for the Army or the Air Force. But the reason was not because the fathers had not been strict enough. The reason was that the fathers had been somewhat distant from their children, and they found, what makes sense once you hear it, that when fathers had a warm relationship with their children, those kids, those sons, were then more likely to emulate their fathers because they had that warm relationship.
Yeah.
So those were the sons that developed the more traditional masculine characteristics and were able to pass those physicals and serve in the armed forces. So, just an interesting idea. It's the warmth and the connection between fathers and kids that's important, not, the toughness of the father, which I think some people probably still believe.
That's a very interesting point. Last night when I was going through your book, and right now as you're speaking, I'm having flashbacks on my relationship with my grandfather. And my grandfather never, tried to teach me how to be a man. He wasn't overtly tough with me, tried to make me be a man. But what I realized as you were speaking is that I picked up his ways just by being around him so often and working with him and just talking to him about regular stuff and, whatever. And I realized I have a lot of his personalities, and I'm able to speak my mind. I don't harbor resentment against anyone. I don't have fear of being loved or not being loved, and I'm able to work hard. I like working. And so he was like a living example for me, and being around him caused me to pick up those values. And I didn't even know at the time that it was happening. It did happen. So he didn't have to put forth any other extra effort to make me a man.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what that's an example of good parenting and good fathering. I don't think your grandfather read all the research, and there wasn't much research in those days.
Right.
But some of us figure it out or do bits of it on our own, and that's the way it's supposed to work.
I don't even know if my grandfather. I don't think he knew how to read. He may have, but I don't ever remember him reading. But he would just, he just did what he had to do that was in front of him. And
well, it sounds like he had the right instincts. You were lucky.
Thank you. You mentioned. Oh, let me ask. As a result of that, because I wondered this last night. Fathers are being taught today that they need to tell their children all the time, if not all the time, most of the time, they need to say to their children, "I love you," when you're in a phone call, when you see them before they go to bed. And now I hear a lot of fathers saying to their children, "I love you, I love you, I love you." Is that necessary?
Well, I don't know that it's necessary. I don't think that in itself is a good thing or a bad thing. If it's sincere and it's reflected, as you point out, what's really important is the father's behavior. So
yes.
If he says, "I love you," if he passes through the house for 5 minutes, says, "I love you," and then leaves the house again, that's probably not going to be ideal parenting. If he spends time and has a good relationship with his children, then they're going to know he loves them, whether he says so or not. So I don't think saying so is either good or bad. I think it's perfectly fine to say. I say it a lot to my kids, at least as much because it makes me feel good to say it, whether it makes them feel good or not.
I think that's why a lot of people say it. I think that's why, because it makes them feel good and not necessarily the kids. And I think that, I personally think, and you could correct me on this, men who are doing that is not really, it's not really a manly thing, a man's things to do. And the reason for that, Paul, is I never heard, I don't ever remember it. I tried hard to remember last night because I knew I was going to ask you about this. I never remember my grandfather saying that he loved me. But
Right.
growing up, I just knew he did without even thinking about it. I knew he did because there was
Right.
nothing there to say he didn't love me, or so I didn't miss anything. There was no emptiness that said he didn't love me. Whereas with my father, of whom I did not grow up with, I had a missing of him, and I thought he didn't love me because he wasn't around.
Right. Well, I think that's the key point. Whether fathers tell their kids they love them or not, I didn't find any research one way or the other that said whether that was important or not important. What is important, as your example shows, is conveying that love through actions and behavior and spending time and all of those things, which really get the message across, and that's very important for children. They feel like they're in a secure environment, and they can develop normally, emotionally, and in terms of their maturation and everything. So that's exactly what's important. You're exactly right.
I have a text question for you. Ask Paul what effect 2 world wars and Korea and Vietnam had on depleting the ranks of fatherhood.
Well, I didn't look at that in particular, and I didn't see research on that, although there may be such research. Part of the problem is that, fathers need to spend some time with their kids. When people are deployed for months or even years at a time, it's nice if they come back for 2 weeks after a year or two's deployment, but that's not going to give them time and opportunity to be the fathers that they should be and, in many cases want to be. I can tell you an interesting piece on that, too. Another thing I came across was that, we think of pregnancy as a time when a lot of hormonal changes are going on in women, and their bodies are adjusting to carry the child, and all of these things are happening. We know about all that stuff. When I discovered that there's research that shows that fathers likewise go through a lot of important hormonal changes. So during pregnancy. So when for fathers who are involved with their partners or spouses during pregnancy, they experience a sharp drop in testosterone. They experience a rise in another hormone called prolactin, which is associated with nursing in women, and changes in their stress hormones and a variety of things that happen, all of which seem to be preparing them biologically to be fathers. The drop in testosterone is associated with less competitive instinct and more emotionally engaging behavior and so forth. So it's quite a sophisticated system that prepares fathers to engage with their children from the moment they're born. Now, if people are in the armed services and they're away fighting a war for months or years at a time, they're not going to have that experience. And there's no way to really counter that. We can't give them a pill to mimic it. There's nothing we can do. And so those are losses. Those are important losses. Now, it doesn't mean that the children of service people are doomed to a difficult life by any means.
Yeah.
There are lots of things they can do, and there are many other aspects of fatherhood that are important.
Let me take a quick break. Sorry about that. Let me take a quick break. We'll come back and take some calls for you as well. Back in a moment.
Need to ask, he's a smooth operator. Smooth operator. Smooth operator. Smooth operator. Coast to coast, LA to Chicago, Western Maine.
Paul Raeburn is with me. Very, very interesting book. I highly recommend it, folks. Do Fathers Matter? What science is telling us about the parent we've overlooked. And we're going to get to your calls now. 888-775-3773. So many things I would like to ask Paul, but I want to be fair to the callers here. Paul, tell the folks how to get your book.
You can order it on Amazon. It should be in Barnes & Noble stores or independent bookstores, anywhere you look, or you can get instructions from my website, which is paulraeburn.com, and that's Raeburn. I'd really love people to stop by there and sign up for my newsletter on the science of fatherhood, because the book is out, but there'll be more to come.
Yes. You mentioned that when the man get the wife pregnant, his testosterone drop. And I thought that was very interesting, because I realized that, and I believe in God, I realized that God has already set up everything to work on his own in a natural way. And I believe one of the reasons that it drops, because if it didn't, men would be trying to have sex even during the pregnancy, and because you know how sex is to the average man, but that kind of helps him to hold back for a while.
Yeah, it definitely makes a change. And I think, again, it was one of those things that was a really sort of shocking and surprising discovery when it was made, because we really think men are pretty much bystanders during pregnancy. There's nothing to do yet, is what we thought. So this was quite a surprise. But, once you realize this is going on, as you say, it's a great setup. It makes a lot of sense, and good for the family and good for the kids.
I think that a lot of people are uncomfortable with knowing that changes happens in the man's body too when the woman gets pregnant, because I think, and I could be wrong about that, in their mind they think that's not manly.
Well, we do love our testosterone, don't we?
Uh-huh.
We men. Yeah, there's no question. I think it's an interesting psychological point that you make. Testosterone is associated with aggressiveness and competition, and in some circumstances those are good things. When we're out in the working world, it's a competitive world, and we want to be tough. We want to be able to compete and make a living and do all those things. But child rearing is a different thing, and in fact, the testosterone turns out to be even more important than what I've already mentioned. There was a study in 2013 that showed that fathers who devote more effort in child care have lower testosterone than fathers who devote less effort to child care. So, the more testosterone you have, that's correlated with less time with child care, and the reverse. So, as you said, does that mean if we spend too much time with our kids, we're no longer manly men? Well, I mean, in one sort of way, I suppose that's true, but it makes us better fathers. So I think if we lose a little testosterone and lose a little whatever that represents, being better fathers is a pretty good project, I think.
Yeah. Plus, it comes back once you're ready to reproduce again. You get it all back. It's not like it goes away. It doesn't come back. And it only makes sense to me, especially after reading your book and now hearing you talk about it. It only makes sense to me that there will be changes in the father's body, because the child, in all reality, is coming from the father. And the mother just carrying the child for the father, but it's really everything that's in that seed or whatever, the sperm, is coming from the father. I remember, Paul, growing up, heard of men who, once their wife got pregnant, they would sometimes feel sick on the stomach or throw up. They were feeling the symptoms that the mother would feel.
Right. So this is a symptom known by a fancy French word, which is couvade. And I don't know exactly what that word means now that I think about it, but what the reference is to the fact that not only do some men experience morning sickness and so forth, but a lot of men gain weight. And you might think that's just because if a pregnant woman is hungry and she's eating a lot of treats that she wouldn't normally eat, maybe her partner is eating a lot of those things too. And that may be true, but it turns out, again, these hormonal changes, these physical changes in fathers will, in some men, allow them to gain weight. And I have actually a very funny story. I looked at a lot of animal research in the book because, a lot of what we can learn about humans comes from animals. There aren't too many good fathers in the animal kingdom. Most fathers split as soon as they sort of technically become fathers. They're gone.
Yeah.
But there's one species. There's a little monkey called the titty monkey, Titi monkey, And in this case, this father, gains a lot of weight, something like 40% more weight during, the pregnancy of the female. And the reason is that when the offspring are not feeding, so they nurse with the mother. When they're not nursing, they're almost always on the father's back, and he carries them around. And so he actually loses weight during the first weeks of the offspring's lives because he's working so hard to carry them around on his back. So, just an interesting example of that parallels what happens in some men. We're mammals. We're not a whole lot like kitty monkeys, but we both have pretty much the same biological systems, and some of the same things happen.
Amazing. Let's go out to Montgomery, Alabama, listening on 1410 AM in Prattville, Montgomery, and talk to Roger. Roger, thanks for calling. You're on with Paul Raeburn.
Well, it's a wonderful topic, and the host is all over it. Thank you both for being on this. My question to the author is, what impact has Great Society programs had on fatherhood in America?
Well, I didn't look too much. Basically what I did is confine myself to the research on fathers and what they contribute to their children. Now, that has a lot of policy implications. I didn't look at any particular, historical policies, Great Society, or any other things like that. It really, partly because, that's really a separate book. There's a whole lot to say about that, and it's very complicated. And it just was too much to take on. In fact, I'm interested in that myself and may do some more writing on that. But what we can say from the research that I've seen is that, it's important for fathers to engage with their kids, and it's important for fathers to spend time with their kids. Now, you may know that of all the industrial countries, the only country that does not require paternal leave time is the United States. There are a couple of other countries, I think Papua New Guinea and Lesotho, and there may be one other, but we're in a group with which we don't belong, and the group which we do belong with, the other advanced nations, all require paternal leave. Now, the research that I've looked at says that's a good thing. Men should spend a lot of time, or as much time as they can, with their kids when they're born and in the first days and weeks. Now, you might think of that as government intrusion. You might think of that as a Great Society kind of program. And, I think that's worth talking about and thinking about.
Paul, I'm sorry.
Fathers,
let me take a quick break. You should finish that point. Hold, Roger. I'll let Paul finish his comment with you.
Baby, if I made you mad for something I might have said, please don't forget my past. The future looks bright ahead. Don't be cruel to who heart is true. Don't be cruel to who heart is true.
Talking about fathers, it is the most important thing in America today. Uniting or rebuilding fathers to bring them back to their normal state of being, encouraging them to get married, and fathers and mothers guide their children by example in the right way to go. I saw this fall apart in the black community, and when they removed that father and the government became the daddy, the corrupt black leaders became the head of the folks. It's just been downhill ever since, and nothing is making it better, because it takes a father and a mother together. No government, no white folks or black folks. It takes a father and a mother to guide their children by being a good example for them. Paul is with me, Paul Raeburn. His book is Do Fathers Matter? What Science is Telling Us About the Parent We Have Overlooked. And just a little, Paul is a journalist and a father of 5. He writes about fathers. He writes about fathers blog for Psychology Today. And I want to ask him something about that I read a while back. Roger, are you still there?
I am, Jesse.
Paul, did you finish your statement for Paul? Your comment for Paul?
I did. Yeah, I'd be interested in what Roger thinks about more paternal leave for fathers and whether he thinks that'd be a good idea.
I think it doesn't matter if they're not in the house to begin with. I think the first part is to have Jesse's creed of rebuilding the family first. Then we can talk about maternity leave as for men. I mean, at this point, it's irrelevant. It's a second point down the road somewhere.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. If the father's not in the house, that's not a good thing.
Yeah.
I guess then a follow-on question in a hopeful sense would be, could you tell us about how being a father is good for the men who are fathers then? What's in it for the men?
Before you respond to that, Paul, let me just say,
Yeah.
I've never thought of it this way before now, because when I first heard of fathers receiving maternity leave, I thought, wow, that's so girly. But paternity leave, I'm sorry. I thought that was girly. But what I realize now is that the reason they didn't have to do that when I was growing up, because we worked the farm and father or grandfather were always around. Whereas now they have to go out and work, and the kids can't go to work with them. And so a lot of kids are just seeing their fathers coming and going and not having that time with them. So now I think I'm okay with that too, because I understand the need of it.
Yeah. Well, I live in New York City, and my older kids, I lived in New Jersey, and I commuted into work in the city. And so I had an hour and a half commute each way, and I made sure I got out of work on time to get home and see my kids before they went to bed and to read them some stories. But I knew lots of fathers in New York at the time who didn't see their kids at all during the week simply because they didn't get home till 8 or 9 at night after the kids were in bed, and not a good thing.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, Roger. Go ahead.
Well, so as part of the motivation then, for men to want to be part of that family way, what's in it for these men? Now, Jesse talks often about, to me, what I call and ask about what are the barriers, in the household, reasons why men would cling to as why to not be part of that household. But on a personal level, to the adult male, what happened? What's in it for a man to be a dad?
Well, there is actually some research on that, and it's actually very good for a dad emotionally and even physically. It's good for his health. And I can tell you, if we go back to looking at hormones in men, get back to our old friend testosterone here, that when men play with their children, they get a rise in another hormone called oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is associated with bonding and emotional attachment and so forth. So when fathers play with their kids, they get a boost in oxytocin. That's what we know from the research. What's interesting to speculate about is that, if men and women have a good relationship, that also is associated with a higher level of oxytocin. So you might wonder whether fathers who play with their kids a lot are going to have this hormonal change that's going to make them more responsive and more attached to their wife or partner. So what we have here is a situation where not only is playing with the children good for the father's health and emotional adjustment, it may actually improve his relationship with his wife. So very interesting to think about, and there are a lot of these kinds of connections. Good health in fathers predicts good health in kids, and even vice versa. Plus, spending time with kids predicts good health in fathers. So there is a lot of biology that suggests why this is good for fathers. I have to say, though, that as a father myself, I don't think about that so much when I spend time with my kids. I just think it's fun. I enjoy it.
Yeah.
So I get a lot of return that way, and I don't need any research to tell me about that.
Yes. Roger, very, very good questions. Thank you so much for your call. I'm looking at the clock here, Paul, and I can't believe that the time is almost up, but there are so many things I wanted to ask. I talked about this on my show couple weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, as well as my Sunday services. I believe this came from one of your books. We read that a pregnant mother have better we read that pregnant mothers have better pregnancy when the fathers are around. I read that on Psychology Today blog, and I believe that came from your book. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true. There are a lot of connections. Father's connection with the mothers, starting even in pregnancy. We talked about the changes in fathers, but there's data that show that when fathers are involved with the mothers during pregnancy, those kids will not only do better as toddlers, they will have an easier transition into school in pre-K or kindergarten. That's going to be a tough time for a lot of kids. But these connections during pregnancy can have lifelong consequences. It's even correlated with better health when the kids are adults. So, it's important, even in families.
I'm sorry, Paul.
Go ahead.
I hate to interrupt, but I got to pay some bills. Right back, folks. Man, this is right up my alley. Can a man have an upper alley thing going on? Okay. This is right up my alley. Talking about fathers. It is the most important thing that I can think of. Once we rebuild families, folks, put fathers and mothers back together along with children, then America will change. Patrick Rooney will be here tomorrow behind the headlines. One of the smartest white men on this side of heaven. Paul, once again, we have about 2 or 3 minutes left here. Tell the folks how to get Do Fathers Matter.
Okay, it's called Do Fathers Matter, What Science is Telling Us About the Parent We've Overlooked. You can go to my website, paulraeburn.com. You can go to Amazon, search for Fathers or Dads. That should work. Or check your local bookstore and pick up a copy. And by all means, send me an email on my website after you've looked at the book and let me know what you think and let me know if you have any other questions.
They're going to love the book, and they're going to have many questions. I wrote 11 questions for you, and I only got to about 3 or 4 of them. I can go on and on. I do want to ask this. I want to confirm something you said and then ask a quick question. I started a private school, Bond Leadership Academy, for boys and girls last September. I teach an ethics class on Friday. And I noticed that in the class, there are a couple of kids or at least 2 I know that have fathers and mothers, but there's one, his father was involved in the pregnancy with his wife. His father is close to his child. And I noticed that this boy's personality is different than the rest of the kids in that he's calmer, he's considerate. He learned very easily. He's thorough in his work, and he seemed not to overreact to negative situations that are coming from other kids. And I realized that it's because of the involvement of the father during the whole thing, during the pregnancy and now in his life.
Well, I can give you a short answer because I can read you something right from the book, which speaks exactly to that. Children whose fathers play with them, read to them, take them on outings, and help care for them have fewer behavioral problems in their early school years and a lesser likelihood of delinquency as adolescents. So good fathering is not going to keep every kid out of delinquency or keep every kid out of trouble, but it's way going to improve the odds for those kids, and that's what you're seeing, I think, in that one individual.
Paul, I've truly enjoyed talking to you. Thanks for coming on.
Jesse, you really asked a lot of great questions, and I've enjoyed it, too.
This has been the Jesse Lee Peterson Show, produced by Bond, Brotherhood Organization of a New Destiny. Views expressed by guests and callers on today's program may not necessarily represent the views of the station. For more information, call 1-800-411-BOND. That's 1-800-411-BOND. Or visit our website at bondinfo.org.